Unfortunately, I feel that the way that the prosecutor in this case responded to it was not the right way. It ventured into trying to embarrass Ashley Benefield and to ridicule her and to mock her. Despite taking the stand in her own defense, a Florida jury has convicted a former ballerina of manslaughter for the shooting death of her husband in what has been dubbed the Black Swan murder trial. Plus, in another case of marital violence, the murder trial of Christine Ricci, accused of stabbing her Boston firefighter husband in the heart, is now in the hands of a Massachusetts jury. All this and more this week on Courtroom Confidential. Hey guys, lots of interesting cases to get into this week, but the two that we're going to focus on in particular are Ashley Benefield and Christine Ricci. And they're similar in the sense that they both involve women allegedly taking the lives of their husbands, going through marital strife, allegations of domestic violence in the home, and they're both making arguments for self-defense. But I think what you're going to find is that what is more interesting about these cases when comparing them to each other are the differences, the factual differences, and why those differences may end up making the difference in how the jury reacts to each of these cases. So let's go ahead and jump right in. First, a Florida jury deliberated for a little over 6 hours on Tuesday before finding ballerina Ashley Benefield guilty of manslaughter in the death of her husband, 58-year-old Navy veteran Doug Benefield, in a case local reporters had dubbed the Black Swan murder trial. Benefield, wearing a printed blouse and light blue blazer, had no visible reaction as the verdict was read shortly before 11 p.m. local time. Benefield admitted to fatally shooting her husband inside a Lakewood Ranch, Florida home in September of 2020, but claimed she was in fear for her life and acted in self-defense. Originally charged with second-degree murder, the six-person jury instead found her guilty of the lesser-included offense. Benefield took the stand on Friday. During her testimony, including a scathing cross-examination, she appeared emotional at times and could be seen shaking and crying as she recounted the deadly incident. "I thought he was going to kill me," she said. She alleged that earlier that day, when she tried to leave the house, Doug pulled her back by the hand and placed himself between her and the door. He said, "Where the F do you think you're going?" Benefield testified. She claimed he then proceeded to hit the side of her head. "He had never actually hit me before," Benefield continued. She told the jury she next ran to the bedroom and retrieved a gun she kept inside a bin in the room. Doug was standing in the doorway. His face was red, like the veins were bulging in his neck. The way he was looking at me didn't even look like Doug, she testified. She claimed she then pointed the gun at him after he said, "You're effing done," and she pulled the trigger when he started lunging toward her. The trial started on July 24th, which included over a dozen witnesses called by the prosecutors and a handful by the defense, in addition to Benefield herself. Ashley Benefield now awaits sentencing, where she faces a maximum of 30 years in prison. What's happening here? Well, how did her testimony affect this trial? And that's what I'm really curious to hear all of your thoughts about, because I hear what you guys say, and I follow, the Twitter sphere and local coverage, national coverage on these cases. And there was a feeling that she had been doing pretty good for herself, that the defense had done a good job of adequately presenting all of the alleged behavior, abusive behavior by Doug, that he had fired a handgun into the ceiling to stop her from talking at one point, that he had punched the dog unconscious. Many people talked about this incident with the dog and what kind of a person punches a dog, that he himself carried a firearm and was always, quote unquote, pulled back and ready to fire, according to one witness. And I feel like the sentiment, again, this is just anecdotal sort of evidence, was that this did sound like an abusive home. And it did sound like she had maybe a good reason to fear for her own life in that instance, and that perhaps she was justified in pulling the trigger, in defending her own life. That was the feeling that you got, I think, until she testified. And something interesting happened. And I'm curious what you guys all feel about it, because I feel that the tide may have turned a bit. And that's not with everyone, but with some folks, there was the idea that her testimony was not entirely genuine, and she was emotional and she appeared to be crying at several points, but many people talked about how they couldn't really see tears and that her emotions and reaction didn't really seem to be genuine. And then something else happened. Then she went on cross-examination, and the cross by the prosecutor was harsh, and it was scathing, and it was, I want to talk about this a little bit more, but I think it even really crossed the line into being embarrassing or intending to embarrass or ridicule the defendant for testifying or the way that she was testifying. We'll get into that for a moment. But even then, the way that Ashley Benefield was testifying under cross, many people found to not be believable. And I'm not going to really get into whether or not I believed it, but to point out something that I've talked about many times on this channel, how difficult it is for a defendant to testify, how you nearly have to be perfect. And it's not even most important, the words that are coming out of your mouth, but it's how you're presenting yourself. This is how we communicate. We all know this, that it's a vast majority the way that you do it, the way that you present yourself, your body language, your confidence, your demeanor. Are you scared? Are you crying? Is it genuine? We can assess all of that on mute without having to hear the words come out of someone's mouth. And then it's also what they have to say. If what they have to say is just flat out unbelievable and doesn't make sense and doesn't comport with the facts and doesn't stand up under cross-examination, that's a huge problem too. But if your demeanor and the way that you're testifying does not seem to be genuine, jurors are going to judge you for that. And I think that that did happen, certainly in the realm of public opinion, but I think that that happened also with the jurors to some extent in this case, that she may have been close to an acquittal. But I think after hearing her testify and that her explanations both didn't seem to warrant her actions as far as a strict self-defense argument goes, and then she herself did not seem to, her emotions didn't seem to align with what she was saying she was experiencing, it may have been a problem. Again, I know a lot of you feel differently, and I know a lot of you are going to say, I felt she was very genuine and she should have been found not guilty. But some people also changed their minds quite significantly after hearing her testify. The other thing here is that the prosecution has also received a lot of criticism for the way that she handled the cross-examination. And I feel that I can critique this and that I can weigh in on this a little bit. And I certainly know how difficult it is to put on a case and conduct a cross-examination. And I try to give most of the attorneys I talk about on this channel a lot of breathing space. But having been a prosecutor, having been in that position, I do feel that I can say something about this. And I do think she crossed the line. First of all the situations for a prosecutor to find themselves in, this is going to be one of the most difficult. You have a female on the stand who's very sympathetic. She's talking about having suffered physical and emotional abuse, and you're trying to cross-examine her and essentially call her a liar and say, none of that is true and you are responsible for murder. And you really have to be able to do a high wire act on how you handle that, because you can't get too harsh and you can't be too soft. And it's difficult because you have someone who's visibly shaken and crying. And how do you respond to that? Unfortunately, I feel that the way that the prosecutor in this case responded to it was not the right way. It ventured into trying to embarrass Ashley Benefield and to ridicule her and to mock her. And at one point, she asked her to come off of the stand and demonstrate exactly what was happening and what Doug was doing in the moments before he was shot. And Ashley, quite frankly, did not do well. She didn't perform well. She was vague. She didn't have a clear description of what was going on. But instead of pointing that out or allowing it to speak for itself, the prosecutor mocked it and started mimicking her and ridiculing her. And I feel that that was not the right tone to strike. You have to read the room. As a prosecutor, as a defense attorney, you have to see, are the jurors on board with what you're doing? Do they feel that the person testifying is as much a liar as you feel that they are? And if they do, go for it and have at it. But if they don't, if they might be sympathetic to what this person was going through, what Ashley was going through at that moment, you got to pump the brakes. You cannot come at her as hard as you were. Was that the difference maker here? I don't know. I think the prosecution is walking away from this case thinking of it as a win because they did secure a conviction. But who knows if the way that she handled that may have backfired on her to some extent. One last point on this case, because a lot of people have been talking about it, is the jury came back quick. It was a quick case. Jurors are unpredictable. They sometimes have already made up their minds by the time they get back into the deliberation room. But the part that was quick to me was they had indicated at one point to the judge that they were deadlocked and at an impasse. And the judge didn't give them the dynamite instruction, didn't give them any strong words about, reconsidering and looking at all the evidence, just kind of sent them back in to think about it. And they came back, I think, within an hour saying, okay, well, now we have a verdict. That's a little bizarre to me. I think what that indicates more than anything is that maybe one person was holding up that jury, and that one person was not as dug in to their position as they may have indicated at first. And perhaps it was one of those things where the jurors are trying to respect everyone's opinion. They say, well, let's let the judge know what's going on. The judge says, go back there and deliberate more. And that juror just kind of, crumbles under a little bit of pressure. It was a 6-person jury too. So who knows what dynamic that played in all of it. But as always, I want to hear your thoughts. Do you guys think that this was the right result? Are you happy with this? Do you think it was a miscarriage of justice? Should she have been convicted of second-degree murder, or should she have walked out the door? And was it a mistake for her to testify, or was this one of those situations where she simply had to explain to jurors what exactly she was thinking in those final moments? Please let me know in the comments. Moving on, trial concluded this week for a Massachusetts woman facing murder charges in the fatal stabbing of her Boston firefighter husband. Christine Ricci is charged with murder in the January 2021 death of Michael Ricci, age 51. According to first responders, Michael had been stabbed in the heart and on the back of his left shoulder. Ricci's defense has argued that her husband had been suffering a manic episode for 3 days when he came in from shoveling snow. Ricci claimed an argument ensued and that her husband became aggressive, grabbed her throat, and threw her to the floor. Ricci claims she then grabbed a knife to scare him away. He then lunged at her, and that's when she plunged the knife into his chest. The trial took a dramatic turn this week when Janine Bouchard took the stand. Bouchard was at one time Michael Ricci's mistress. She testified that their 6-week affair occurred in 2018. Bouchard told the jury that at the time of the affair, she thought Christine and Michael were separated. About a month after Michael abruptly ended the affair, she received a text message from Christine telling her to stay away from Michael. Bouchard also claimed Christine showed up at her house on 2 separate occasions, including in January of 2020, when she called police and Christine left. Courtroom observers had to wait until the last moment to learn that Christine Ricci decided against taking the stand in her own defense. The defense began their closing statement with the emphatic declaration, "The Commonwealth never proved beyond a reasonable doubt that Christine Ricci intended to kill her husband." Later adding, Christine Ricci never intended to kill Michael. She never intended to stab Michael. What happened was an incredible tragedy that was the result of everything that was going on in the home the previous 2 years. For their part, the Commonwealth began their closing with the words, "The only way to put an end to Christine Ricci's pain, anger, jealousy, and rage that consumed her was to put an end to the very person who caused that pain. She did so by stabbing Michael Ricci intentionally in his heart." At the time of this recording, the jury has yet to reach a verdict. All right, well, what's happening here? What this case, I think, again, how it distinguishes itself from the Benefield case, how it is perhaps stronger for the prosecution than that case, and why it demonstrates in certain cases it is so important for the prosecution to provide motive. I've said this before. Motive is not an element of a crime. Intent is. You have to prove that a person intended to do something, meant to do something. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't something outside of their control. But you don't have to show why they meant to do something. The why, the what's taking place between somebody's two ears is something that the law doesn't require the prosecution to prove, the motive behind it. And you may say to yourself, well, it sounds a little bit like you're splitting hairs. And it is a nuanced difference, but it's a very important difference, because in a case like this, the prosecution could have just shown, listen, she was holding the knife. She stabbed him with the knife. You know that that wasn't an accident. You know that she intended to stab him with that knife. That's intent. But why was she arming herself with the knife? Why did she carry any animosity toward her husband in that moment? Is important, especially in a case like this, where you're talking about a husband and wife, you're talking about domestic violence, marital strife in the home, and you're talking about claims of self-defense by the defendant. You need to give the jurors a reason why this woman did this. Why did this woman take her husband's life in that moment? And this case, I think, provided a very strong reason for that, and that was the affair. And she was obviously obsessed with the affair and couldn't get over it and allowed it to consume her, and it had become an obsession and may have, according to the prosecution, boiled over inside of this woman to that point that this wasn't a woman defending herself. This was a woman arming herself to end the life of that person who had caused her so much pain. Now, we will see if that will actually carry the day with the jury. But I think in this case, from the prosecution's perspective, they had to give that reason. Providing the jury without a motive would have been a fatal mistake to their case. Another difference here is that Ricci did not testify. Benefield did. And I think we've all kind of arrived at the idea that maybe that helped her, maybe that hurt her, but she had to. I think Ricci needed to testify here as well. Now, I could be wrong. By the time this is out on YouTube and podcasts, we may already have a verdict, and I could be wrong here, but I think it was a mistake for her to not testify because, again, as much as the prosecution needs to provide the jurors some insight into what's taking place inside of someone's head, so does the defense. The defense, especially in a self-defense case, I think they want to hear from that person. If you're saying, I want you to acquit me, I want you to walk me out the back door, I want you to call this homicide justified, you're going to need to actually tell the jurors that yourself. You're going to need to take the stand, raise your hand, take an oath, and tell the jurors why you were in so much fear, why you had no other choice, and why it was reasonable for you to arm yourself with a knife and stab your husband in the chest. Without giving them that, without almost giving them that courtesy of asking for it, essentially, to the jurors, it might be the difference maker in this case. To me, it's a mistake in a case with these circumstances. Under most circumstances, and you, in the case we just talked about, it's very difficult for a defendant to testify. It's very difficult to be nearly perfect with jurors, but in certain cases, it's almost required. One other thing about this case I think that's worth discussing is the choice of weapon, and will that be a difference maker here? In the Benefield case, you have a gun. In this case, you have a knife. A knife is far more personal, yet a knife, to me, also demonstrates more improvisation, more self-defense, more spur of the moment. I needed to arm myself to defend myself. When you go and grab a gun has no other purpose but to destroy that at which it is pointed at and the trigger is pulled. A knife is something that might be laying around in the kitchen. And if you are being attacked and you feel like somebody is, according to her husband was suffering from some sort of manic episode and she was scared and felt like she needed to arm herself in that moment, she grabbed a knife. A knife can scare someone off. A knife can defend yourself. A knife is not always a weapon of destruction like a gun. And that may be a difference maker in this case as well. What do you guys think about that? That's, again, I'm more curious to hear your thoughts than my own. Do you think the knife is an important issue in this case? Do you think she should have testified? And if we don't have a verdict already, tell me how you guys feel about this case. Which way are you leaning? Let us know in the comments. Before we dive into the other cases making headlines this week, I'm just going to ask you guys this one very small favor. If you haven't already, please make sure to take a moment to subscribe to this channel now. As you know, it helps us to continue to bring you more content every week and provide you with more of all of the interesting cases that you love to follow. If you're already subscribing, thank you so much. And go call a friend and bug them and ask them to please subscribe. And don't forget to check out Courtroom Confidential as a podcast. You can join our community on all of the major podcast platforms. Also making headlines this week, appearing in an orange jail jumpsuit and shackles, Nicolae Miu was sentenced on Wednesday to 20 years in prison for the fatal stabbing of Isaac Schumann, plus 4 counts of first-degree recklessly endangering the safety of other victims. Miu was convicted in April for a stabbing that took place on the Apple River in Somerset, Wisconsin, which allegedly started when Miu was looking for a cell phone in the river but was confronted by tubers who said he was acting sketchy. The encounter escalated and another group of tubers came over. Miu was punched in the face, which eventually led to him pulling a knife and attacking the group. Miu maintained that the stabbing was in self-defense, claiming that he acted out of fear in the quickly developing conflict. His sentencing coming 2 years and a day after the fatal fight, Miu faced decades behind bars. Prosecutors had even requested 70 years incarceration, but with no sentencing guidelines in Wisconsin, Judge Michael Waterman had full discretion. Miu is 54 years old. Defense attorneys in Young Thug's slow-moving trial said Wednesday that they were outraged again after learning of yet another secret meeting between Fulton County prosecutors and the case's former judge involving a reluctant state witness. Defense lawyers were handed a copy of the June 7th meeting transcript as court wrapped up Tuesday, hours after the new judge, Paige Whitaker, asked everyone involved to disclose any ex parte meetings that they had with Judge Earl Glanville. Glanville was removed from the longest criminal trial in Georgia history over his handling of multiple recusal motions that attorneys filed following a secret meeting he had with prosecutors and their star witness, Kenneth Copeland. Earlier, Judge Whitaker had denied a mistrial motion and change of bond for all defendants. No decision has yet been made on this latest development. Delphi murder suspect Richard Allen's defense team accused investigators Tuesday of intentionally keeping evidence that could prove their client's innocence as they sought to convince Judge Francis Gull to dismiss the case against their client. During the defense team's motion to dismiss, attorney Andrew Baldwin argued that investigators failed to investigate a man who had alleged ties to Odinism, including cryptic Facebook posts that connected him to the crime scene, and who should have been a primary suspect in the 2017 deaths of Abby Williams and Libby German. Allen, who was arrested in October 2022, more than 5 years after the teens' deaths, is facing 4 murder charges. The case is one of the most high-profile in Indiana state history and has attracted worldwide attention. However, it has been plagued with delays, controversies, and seemingly endless legal and procedural fights. Trial is expected to start this fall. The man charged in rapper Tupac Shakur's 1996 killing claimed Sean Diddy Combs allegedly offered up $1 million for the hip-hop legend's murder. Court papers filed last week in a Nevada court in the case against Dwayne Keefe D. Davis, the former Los Angeles area gang leader accused of orchestrating Shakur's killing, included several interviews law enforcement took of Davis in the last 2 decades where he made claims regarding Combs' connection to the murder. This comes on top of the mounting list of civil lawsuits Combs faces, alleging abuse and sexual assault by multiple victims spanning over 30 years, and a recent notification by federal authorities that Combs is the subject of an ongoing criminal investigation. Before we get into what's on the docket for next week, I want to take this moment to thank you all so much for your support. The love from this growing community has been absolutely breathtaking. We would like to give a special shout out, however, to Becky1949 for her glowing review on Apple Podcasts, and to Tina Lomborn7458 and Ida Shaw JD for their kind words on YouTube. Keep them coming, folks. We always highly appreciate your feedback, and tell us where you're from. We're always thrilled to hear about the growth of our international Courtroom Confidential crew. On the docket for next week, a New Jersey father found guilty of aggravated manslaughter in the death of his 6-year-old son, who prosecutors argue died from injuries sustained from chronic abuse, will be sentenced on August 2nd. Christopher Gregor was convicted in May of aggravated manslaughter for the death of his son, Corey Michiolo. The case captured national attention in large part because of surveillance footage from a fitness center at Gregor's apartment complex presented at trial showing Corey running on a treadmill as his father increases the speed. In the video, the boy stumbles and falls multiple times as he attempts to keep up. Gregor can be seen grabbing Corey by the shirt, and at one point he appeared to bite the child's head in an effort to keep the boy running through obvious exhaustion. Corey faces up to 40 years in prison. Accused killer Sarah Boone is still looking to hire an attorney, but for now she's on her own and she's already running into issues. In court last Thursday, Boone expressed frustration that the hearing, which the court had scheduled the day before, came as a surprise to her. "I am thoroughly confused," she told the judge. "If I'm pro se and my own attorney, shouldn't I be included in all of this? And so I know what's going on and not a surprise hearing like it is for the second time?" Judge Wayne Wooten responded, "Ma'am, again, this is why there are benefits to being represented by counsel." Her next hearing is set for August 5th, with her trial set to begin on October 7th. A New Jersey lawyer accused of a string of sexual assaults in Boston over 15 years ago is due back in court on August 8th. Matthew Nilo has been charged with over 5 attacks on 4 women in the city's historic North End between 2007 and 2008. Nilo, now 35, who attended Boston Latin School, was brought back to Boston last year from his apartment in New Jersey after a cold case investigation by Boston police and federal authorities connected him to the Charlestown assaults. Well, that's it for us this week, folks, but I did want to give you a little tease that we have an exciting announcement coming next week. We have a lot of things in the works here at Courtroom Confidential that we are very thrilled to share with you, but not just yet. So please tune in next Friday when we have all of that to share with you. In the meantime, I'm your host, Josh Ritter. You can find me on social media at Joshua Ritter ESQ or at joshuaritter.com. And thank you again for joining me. Have a great weekend, and I'll see you again next week for another episode of Courtroom Confidential.